If you're visiting with us, welcome. We are at the end of a series. This is the 45th teaching in the series, believe it or not. You're like, wow, that's a lot. In the Gospel of Mark. And appropriately, we left this Lenten season on the last week of Jesus. So we started the season of Lent on Ash Wednesday, which is all the way back on February 14th, with Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. And then Mark, from chapter 11 on, that's where the story comes to a screeching halt to spend this last week of Jesus. So we walked through all sorts of things. And Good Friday, two days ago, we took a blitz through a couple chapters of all the events leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. And now we've arrived on the most important day of the Christian year. So you've already heard this today. When someone says, "He is risen," you respond, "He is risen indeed." Some of you have a church memory and know what that's all about. Some of you think that's really weird and cultish. I agree with all of you. But really, it's something that's traditionally been said for such a long time. And this is the most significant day of the Christian calendar. And it's also just the strangest thing at the same time. In some ways, it does feel a little cultish about this whole concept of the resurrection of Jesus. So we're going to dive into that this morning, and we're going to look at Mark chapter 16 as the account of that. We're going to read verses 1 through 8, and you'll recognize that this is the end of the series today, and we're only going to verse 8, and there's a bunch of verses after this, but I'll explain why we're not doing that afterwards. But we're going to read verses 1 to 8 in chapter 16 of Mark. We'll have it on the screen as well. And I'm going to read out of the New English Translation this morning. And this is what Mark records. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought aromatic spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, at sunrise, they went to the tomb. They had been asking each other, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled back. And then as they went into the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has been raised. He's not here. Look, there is the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples, even Peter, that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. You will see him there just as he told you." Then they went out and ran from the tomb, for terror and bewilderment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The end. Let's pray together. God, I ask in these moments that my words would be your words, and I pray that anything that you have prepared, that I've prepared, that you don't want me to say, don't let it come to mind. God, I pray that something that I haven't written down or thought about, and you want to say, I want you to put it in my mind today to say it. And I pray that you speak to each of us in a fresh way, collectively, and also individually, about this powerful testimony of what the resurrection means to the world. In the name of Jesus, I ask, and everybody said, amen. If you're not a regular participant in church, this is the weirdest story. In fact, I spent a lot of this week browsing my social media accounts, and a lot of the stuff that came up this week were all of these people who would go on college campuses, or they would go somewhere else to argue with people basically about the faith, and they'd be trying to give all this evidence and stuff, and all the questions were all about the resurrection of Jesus and miracles and how that's all a bunch of hogwash and all this kind of stuff. And that was a lot of the stuff that popped up in social feeds this week. It's really fascinating. But if you're being honest, it is a really weird thing to attest that somebody raising from the dead, becoming the central focus of who we are, it does sound a little cultish. I'm just going to be honest. It sounds really strange. That's what I thought, especially when I wasn't a Christian either. I thought this was one of the things that I thought Christians abused people with. I just thought, this is so ridiculous that someone testifies to this resurrection. And today, you're going to be disappointed. I'm not going to present any arguments or evidence about the historical accuracy of the resurrection. In fact, that's pretty explicit in history. There are tons of historians outside of the Bible that testify to the resurrection of Jesus. This is not a sermon or a teaching about that. I'm not here to prove that today, but I'm here to talk to you about why Mark puts this in the text and why it is said the way that it's said, because I told you this is the end even though you have verses afterwards. It's a really strange thing. But what we've called this series is the gospel for Christians, if you haven't been with us. And the reason that we've called it that is because in this gospel, there's a very small amount of content about Jesus' actual teaching, like the content of his teaching. It's all about how people respond to Jesus, the kinds of people that Jesus hangs out with, and the response to that. And so it assumes, the audience assumes that they know the story of Jesus' content. So the question is, are they getting it? And if you've been with us long enough, you've realized quickly that in this book, all the people who are supposed to do the right thing, which are like the disciples, religious leaders, people who've been Jewish for a long time, who are committed to God, they all do everything wrong in this gospel. They are not the people that actually follow Jesus properly. And it's all the outcasts, those who are not acceptable to the religious leaders, to even the disciples. And we'll talk about this later. You remember they rebuked children coming to Jesus, who are the lowest of the low in social status. Like, this can't possibly be, drawing lines in the sand, all about who's on the inside and the outside. I mean, all of those people who are outside are the people who did everything correctly. They were actually living the right way. The entire narrative of this whole book, that's what it says. And so now we come to this account with women, which this is a teaser for a sermon if I've ever give about the evidence part of a sermon. If you want to convince people that the resurrection actually happened in the first century, one of the first things that you should do is not let women be your primary witnesses to this event. Because that is an instant statement of that you're not credible. Women's voices don't matter in the first century. So to have them be your primary witnesses already tells people your story is a bunch of cuckoo. That's a teaser. So the fact that they're even mentioned and that it's still going on today, is this great deception? No. You probably should consider it might be true. That was for free, that advice, all right? That's not what this is about. But these women in this text, the point is, the end of this text that we read is not a happy ending. They're going to anoint Jesus, and you already know they're not going there because they believe Jesus is going to rise from the dead. They're bringing spices and stuff, and what happens is when you bury someone, a Jewish person buries someone, they actually lay them in a temporary space, and then once their body has decomposed to bones, they take those bones and they put them somewhere else. That's how that usually happens. And so these women are coming with these oils and perfumes and all sorts of things. Why? Well, I don't know if you knew this, but when bodies are around and they're dead, they start to smell after a while. And so the way to prevent that in the first century is that you spice them up. That sounds really, really bad. But they spice them up, right? So like you're putting all this stuff on them to make them smell better, right? That's what they're going to do. So it's already assumed these women are going, already believing that he's dead. And they watched him, these women, early in the text. We didn't read this part, but early in the text in Mark, in the previous chapter, they watched Jesus get crucified. They watched Jesus get crucified. And it's really interesting. I don't, and the reason being, because you see all these verses afterwards in verse 8, that seems, and I don't know if you look if you have a Bible with you, you'll see all sorts of different things. Mine has like 2 brackets before the verse starts, and there's 2 brackets at the end of the whole end of the gospel. Some of you might have footnotes if you have other Bibles say, this section, they have all sorts of commentary on it. Here's the deal. Verses 9 to 20 were not in the earliest manuscripts of Mark. The first time they were discovered or even thought about being written were the 4th century. So scholars get perplexed about what to do about this. And here's the thing. The reason this gets included in there is because the early church couldn't deal with the ending in verse 8. Because listen to the ending of this story. You ready? The whole book. But go tell his disciples, even Peter, because Peter denied him 3 times, that he's going ahead of you into Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you. Then they went out and ran into the tomb, and they told everybody. Nope. It says, then they went out and ran from the tomb, for terror and bewilderment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. They were afraid. The end. That's the end of the story. They're afraid. They didn't talk to anybody. That's it. End of the gospel. Which we told you before, Mark is like a movie by your favorite director. Have you ever watched any of those movies that have a non-resolved ending? You're waiting for all this stuff to get to the end and finally be resolved, and it just leaves you hanging. And you're like, oh. Some of you, and it becomes like a love-hate relationship with the movie, right? Some of you are like, that was dumb. Why would I waste 2 to 2.5 hours watching this film for it not to have a resolution? And then there's other of you that's like, wow, that was brilliant. And then you start talking about it. And you start going back. Maybe you watch it again. That's what Mark's doing. I mean, think of Mark like a movie, right? It's one of those non-resolved endings. Why would he put this ending in there? Because what's interesting is that these women in the text, when they watch Jesus get crucified, there's a phrase in there, and proximity is really important in Mark. It says they watched him get crucified from a distance. Not the Bette Midler song, okay? For those of you that are older and remember that. Don't start singing either. I'm starting to sing in my head right now. I'm not trying not to let it come out, all right? Because it's also kind of a little cuckoo theology. Anyway, but from a distance. And in the gospel, there's mentions of from a distance. And in Mark, from a distance, that being that far away, its intention is always negative. So, as much as, even last year, where I'm propping up women's voices, being the first witness of the resurrection, and that is intentional, which is true, that's not this sermon today. These women also mess up just like the disciples do. Just like the religious leaders do. Just like all the people who are supposed to be doing the right things do. They watch Jesus get crucified from a distance, which is a foreshadowing of this moment, and then they run away terrified. And then you read the rest of the gospel that wasn't in the earliest manuscripts, and they finally tell people. And everything's great. And there's other gospels that have that testimony. And we'll talk about that a little later, but that's not the ending that most scholars say is what's happening. It's like, this is where the end really is, and you have to deal with that. So what do we do with that? How do we figure that out? Because there's another phrase in here that we also misinterpret. It says there's a young man sitting on the tomb, which, and by all intents and purposes, is an angel. And you can look at other gospel accounts. This is the same testimony. But the angels, they all have the same sequence of how things happen. They always say the same things. People are freaking out, and they say, do not be afraid, or do not be alarmed. That's what they say. And it says that they go in terror and bewilderment. If you came Friday, we talked about Pontius Pilate. And when he was asking Jesus questions, Jesus responds, and it said Pilate was amazed. And you want to think, that's the kind of amazed, like, ooh, cool. Oh, wow, that makes you really think. But that's not what Mark means by that. Amazed is a negative term. Amazed would be more like, really? That's what that means. That's the kind of reaction that these women are having. Like, no, really? They're all confused. And that's the ending of the book. It is horrible for people that want a resolution. It doesn't seem to be very good news other than, okay, did Jesus really rise from the dead? I mean, where is he? We don't know. And they're supposed to tell people, and they're not going to tell anybody. So now what's going to happen? Well, we already know the end of the story because you're sitting here, and we're listening to it. So something happened. And those in the 2nd to 4th century couldn't deal with that ending of Mark. It doesn't, I can't put my head around it. And scholars now say, look, you probably didn't pay attention to the whole book of Mark. Because if you paid attention, and if you've paid attention, if you've been here for 44 teachings of Mark, or at least most of them, you've noticed some themes. That's what's really cool about sitting and reading a book of the Bible in one setting. is that you start to get vibes from it that you wouldn't see if you just read it individually in like sections. You start to see like themes pop out. Some of the things I've already told you about all the people who do the right things do the wrong things, and all the people who are the outcasts do the right things. What does that even mean? What does Jesus get really angry at? Why is he so hard on the religious leaders? What's going on? Why isn't there any content in Jesus' teaching? What's happening? What's this about seeing and hearing all the time, and the distance stuff, and the proximity, and the timing, and all this kind of, what is that? There's all sorts of vibes that come out of this book. I mean, it's like that song that gets sung, and you have that chord that you just need to play at the end to make it resolve, and you don't do it, and you just leave that minor chord out there, and that's the end of the song, and you just, ah! But here's the thing. If you really think about a movie or a song that doesn't resolve, I mean, what do you do with it? Even if you don't like it. You talk about it, don't you? It disrupts you. It arrests your mind and your heart. And you start thinking about it. That's exactly what Mark wants to do with his whole book. So why would we be surprised that he has an ending like this? Again, it's the gospel for Christians. He's writing this to the church. And arguably, the date of this book, which is argued between 65 and 75, I say 68, I'm just going to point to a date, but that is in and around the time that the temple gets destroyed by Rome. Everything the Jewish people knew about life and how to function as a Jewish person was obliterated in the year 70 when the temple was destroyed. Their entire way of life centered around that building, which Jesus had walked into 40 years before and pronounced final judgment upon it, saying, you're no longer relevant because you're not living into the way that God wants you to live. And his presence is no longer here. His presence is now in this person called Jesus. The temple has left the building. And then the testimony will be interesting because it's going to move further than just Jesus when we get to the book of Acts and Pentecost comes about. But I believe Mark is doing with this text what I like to do with teachings here. You know, I go to school to get trained as a pastor. There's all sorts of interesting stories about that, but I remember taking a class on this thing, preaching, they say. And one of the postures that they have about preaching is that a sermon should always be the final word on a conversation. So that when I'm giving it, so what happens is, what the sermon becomes is basically some type of speech that everyone else listens to that they can say, yep, that is what the final authority should be. And that's it. I disagree with that. And that is my own personal opinion. This is not something that I say, does the Bible say about this? I mean, the Bible is pretty vague about what definitive is about preaching, other than, yeah, it's a proclamation of the scriptures. But whether it's the end of the conversation or somewhere else, who knows? I like to say that a sermon is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of it. What I hope would happen in a proclamation like this is that you would talk about it. That you would figure out, and our mission is on this door frame, living the good news of Jesus 7 days a week, that this teaching would somehow be a good word of prompting you to figure out, how do I actually live this out every day of my life? By the way, that's the beginning of a conversation, not the end of it. That invites you to further reflection. Right? Does that make sense? That's what Mark's doing. So when he writes the end of this story, with the women being in terror, it invites you to reflect on all the things that he said before. Like, what is this whole thing about? What is this book about? And for those of you who have not listened to one single teaching today, good news for you. You get a recap. And remember, like, I wasted 44 teachings on this. No. It's just like, it's like a good sequel, right? It's a great sequel today, but it'd be nice to have the whole series, right? Take it that way. I know, I agree with you. So this should start the conversation. That's what Mark is trying to do. We pointed this out really briefly on Good Friday, but for those of you that weren't there, I'll reiterate. One of the very fascinating things that gets missed in Mark at the very end. There's a whole, the 2 chapters before are all about how these disciples are really messing up. And we talked about on Friday the words like Peter said, I will never, right? I will never. And then he did it a few hours later. The very thing he said he never would do, which I'd say don't ever use the word never, all right? Even in the midst of that, you see the trajectory of these disciples and the people who are closest to Jesus. One of the 12 is the one who betrayed him. It wasn't someone from the outside. It wasn't someone that was on the periphery. It was someone that was in the circle of 12 that betrayed Jesus, which we said on Friday, don't think that you're exempt. Don't think that you would not betray Jesus because you would. That's what we talked about Friday. You'll deny him and betray him, and we do it again and again and again. You guys stink. That was the message on Friday. It was good. But in the midst of the text, there's a couple words that are really interesting. In the midst of all this betrayal and denial, Jesus still says and calls them his disciples. And that's important. Even when they're going to deny him, and have. Even when they're going to betray him, he still calls them that. Even when he doesn't measure up to the image that they've created he should be. This is the kind of Messiah you should be, Jesus, which was a military insurrectionist, by the way. That's what they wanted. They didn't get that. Judas couldn't handle it. He tries to kind of poke Jesus a little more aggressively to get in line with that because he wasn't made in his image. Even then, Jesus still says, my disciples. You're my disciples. Most of the time, if someone would betray us like that, or deny us like that, or hurt us like that, you're not going to be my disciple. You're not going to be my friend. Right? And I wouldn't have anything to hold against you. Like it's a natural reaction. I mean, that's a natural reaction to pain and trauma. Like, I'm going to cut this off. Yet Jesus says his disciples, these women are at the tomb, which is significant, which that's a whole other sermon, which I think I gave last year, about why that's important, especially for women. They weren't expecting a resurrection. They're bringing spices to make him smell better because he's dead. They weren't expecting the stone to be rolled away. They were going to ask someone to do it for them, which that's a big stone. I mean, that's a huge stone in this mountain. And it's rolled away, and there's a guy talking about how Jesus isn't there, and they're freaking out. And that's the end of it. And yet, Jesus still wants to insist that they're his disciples. See, it's really interesting in this gospel. You can go one direction, because there's a lot of critique of church leadership doing it the wrong way. And I think I've done 44 teachings enough to help you understand how much of that is still prevalent in churches today. But what's interesting about that is one of the reactions we want to have is the very thing that those we critique do, which I call the great shaming machine. We've set up systems where if you mess up, you don't say things the way that you should say it, or we think you should say it, we write you off, and we let you know it. Maybe for some, you even get canceled, right? And it's interesting because it's really easy to sit in a space where we see this Gospel of Mark and like, look, Jesus is really coming down hard on these people. And it's thinking like, is he shaming them? We've already seen in the Gospel that Jesus always gives them space to change their mind. He tries to enter into a dialogue with them. Now he knows that they really don't want to do that, but he makes the space anyway. Where my reaction is not to do that. I've given you enough space, your time is over. It's time for you to shut up. It's time for other voices to come to the forefront. That's what I really want to say. Maybe in some of my weakest moments, that's what I have said. But it's interesting is that that is the exact reaction that those who I critique in that way are doing. And I do the same exact thing, and now the pendulum swung the other direction. You with me? And Mark invites us to think about that. Because remember, all of the people who are supposed to do the right thing, that's you and me, they mess up. And it's a whole spectrum of things. It's like to the people who think that Jesus is a military insurrectionist, that think that violence and force and coercion is the way of the gospel, you are mistaken. And Jesus constantly says all sorts of things against that kind of thinking. And then on the other end of that, like, I don't like people who do that. There's this and the other. Well, here's the disciples. They're in the insider group. They're in the real insider group. And yet, they don't understand really what Jesus is all about. They even start striving for positions of power. Hey, who's going to be the greatest, Jesus? Mark chapter 10 with James and John. Who's going to sit by your right hand, which means who's going to rule with you? That's what they're thinking about in the midst of someone's disease and being sick. They're asking those questions. Mark invites people like, look, do you see, no matter if you're on this point of like completely outcast, which these religious leaders are speaking against, or your self-righteousness, all of you are guilty. And you need help. And you need to wake up. Because the way of Jesus is the way of the cross. And it has no room for any of that. It has no room for the great shaming machine. And Jesus expects them to be there. I mean, here's what's fascinating. He says to them before he dies, we talked about this earlier in the week, he says, I'm going to die, I'm going to rise again, and I'm going to meet you in Galilee. Meet me there. They're like, what are you talking about? You're not going to die? Like, why are you talking about death? That's not what the Messiah does. That's what they're thinking. Little do they know, a few days later, this is going to come true. And it's all going to come to the world. We don't know that at the end of Mark, but that's what's happening. And he expects them to be there. His disciples, the very people, by the way, all his disciples jetted. They beat it. They left him. They denied him. They ran away, except these women, from a distance in the story. But still from a distance. And then they were terrified and didn't tell anybody. He still expects them to be there after all of that. Can I tell you that if you've come to church, or even right now, you're still trying to figure out this faith thing, or you're still like wondering about this Jesus thing, and you're like, I really don't get this. I really don't fully know why. Or, even more, I've been traumatized by church, and I'm trying to figure out if this is worth it. Can I just give you some encouragement this morning? That's where they were at. And yet Jesus still says, I'll meet you there, which is a statement. And the resurrection says something about this. I haven't given up on you yet. Can you hear me? That's what God says to him. That's what Mark is inviting his audience to consider. Even amidst all of this behavior and all these things you're doing that is against the way of God, against the kingdom of God, God says to you through the resurrection, I haven't given up on you yet. Meet me in Galilee. They still don't understand, friends. They have no clue what's happening. And Jesus still invites them to show up anyway. Which, if you read the narrative of the entire Bible, that happens a lot. There's a lot of things that God is asking people to do, and they're like, I don't get this, or I don't fully understand. And God's like, that's okay. In fact, think about the call of Moses way back in Genesis. Abraham, I want you to go to a place, and he doesn't even tell him where to go. He just says, go that direction. Which I say, God doesn't give us a map, he gives us a compass, right? We want the GPS, but he doesn't give it to us. He just go that way. Moses like, well, or Abraham's like, I really don't want to go that way. Okay, I'll just go that direction. I don't know what's going to happen. Just show up. And in this case, it's to all the people who are denying him. So the whole entire book of Mark, he's always been giving space to people to change their mind and change their thinking. And even when he's dying and when he's raised from the dead after everyone has run away from him, denied him, betrayed him, he still says, hey, I'll meet you in Galilee. There's still a chance for us. He still wants you there. And friends, on this day, this most important day of the year for us, this is why we say it's never too late for anyone. It's never too late to make a commitment to Jesus, which is what Mark is asking. And this commitment is very specific. It's a commitment to the way of the cross, which it's not very great. And it might involve suffering. I mean, we talked about on Wednesday at the Passover Seder, in the midst of this, where Jesus basically saying the way of the cross is being broken open and poured out. His body being broken, his blood being poured out. That's the way. That's what he's inviting his church into. The kingdom of God is this way. He's still saying that way is still there in Galilee, which doesn't sound like very much of a pep talk unless you consider what has just happened. Jesus is no longer dead, which means everything that happened to him, all the stuff he took upon himself, all the denial and the betrayal and the worst that humanity had to offer, doesn't get the final word. It means that people still have a chance to change their mind. It means people have a chance to step into new life. No matter what they've done or what they continue to do, Jesus says, I'll meet you in Galilee. You still have a chance to live differently than you are right now, church. That's what Mark is saying. Wake up. Jesus will meet you in Galilee. Here at New Ground, if you're new with us, we are honestly engaging with how Jesus has called us to live a life of resurrection. And that does mean being honest about the times that we're denying him or betraying him or crucifying him as we walk through on Good Friday through our actions. And I've been in environments in some churches where this has been encouraged and some that haven't. But Mark has told us that if you want to be a Jesus follower, you will be shaped by the way of the cross. You will care about those who are forgotten. You don't seek after power and privilege and status. You don't try to manipulate others or the system. You love people by breaking yourself open and pouring yourself out, not giving them a list of demands to be accepted. That's the way of the cross. And even if you do walk contrary to this way, Jesus says to you, there's still space for you. Follow me. Let's go to Galilee. Meet me in Galilee. And friends, look, this doesn't deny some of the trauma that you may have experienced by those in the church. Can I encourage you? Jesus knows exactly what that's like. We've just spent a whole week talking about it. People who were close to him, who betrayed him and hurt him, who were part of the inside, if you will. Jesus knows what that's like, and they sent him to death. I mean, that's pretty bad. You don't really have that situation, at least that kind of a situation. But sometimes those moments feel like death to you. And the resurrection says that all of that doesn't have the final word for you. And so you'll notice also that there are people in this world who are trying to follow Jesus that aren't trying to give in to the way that is the opposite of the cross. All the things Mark warns about. This gospel isn't just for people traumatized by religious movements. It isn't just for those on the outside. It isn't just for those who are self-righteous. It's an invitation to all of us to surrender to Jesus and his way. And for some odd reason, he still makes space for you. And this is why we say we don't deserve it, because we don't. Because there's a bend of our default that wants to go towards selfishness, that wants to go toward becoming more powerful, to submitting, to getting people to submit to. And Jesus knows this and still says there's space for you. That's why we have hope. And if you were to talk to people in this room who've been here long enough, you would hear stories of resurrection where it seemed like the death of this person is happening. Sometimes literally their physical death. But in a lot of ways, their life being a death. I'm walking in destruction. And maybe they even experienced, for those in churches, the great shaming machine as a result of that. Because I did this thing that wasn't honoring, man, the church really let me know it. They wanted to remind me how awful it was and awful I am as a result. And then Jesus says, I'll meet you in Galilee. And that wasn't their experience from what they had in church. And if you talk to people around here, I think you'll find one of the words that people would use, oddly enough, is the word space. There's space for you. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter what you've thought about God or are currently thinking about God. It doesn't matter the trauma you experienced or the trauma you've caused. Jesus says, there is space for you. And you're sitting here today because you realize that the ending of this gospel wasn't the end, was it? I mean, you're sitting here because something happened. Someone got it, which in history we know the disciples got it. They all went the way of the cross. In fact, 11 of those 12 disciples died horrible deaths because of their identity with Jesus and his way. That doesn't sound like people who didn't get it. They embraced it and lived it. And you're sitting here as a result. I mean, think about this. 2,000 years later. I mean, either there's something to consider about this space, or, man, someone's done a really good job of duping us all. Millions and millions of people, which I'm sure is possible. But as you hear these stories of hope, of space being provided, it doesn't matter where you come from or what you've done, what you think or what you're wrestling with. Jesus says, I'll meet you in Galilee. Come and see. There's space for you here. And I guess the question is that you have to ask yourself, and what Mark is asking you, do you want to come along? I can't answer that for you, but that's the question. So let's pray. I'm grateful, God, that you do not give up on us. For as many times that we deny you, or betray you, or crucify you, or walk in ways that are destructive to both us and others, you still say there's space for you. And so, God, I pray this morning that wherever any of us are in the spectrum of trying to figure out this faith journey, I pray that we would all make the commitment to follow you, that we would surrender to you, that we would start to experience and realize the glorious salvation life that awaits us, that starts today. That can transform even the darkest of hearts and intentions. God, we are so grateful of men and women who embraced this way so long ago, even had their blood spilled out, God, so that we could be sitting here today considering this story, this crazy story of you rising from the dead. But God, there's so much to say about how, because of you, life can now spring from death, and it does not have the final word. And I pray that that hope would move us to be the types of people who live out this good news every single day with others, that we would care about the things that you care about. Lord, that we would resist the things that you warn against. And God, that we would invite all people to the space at the table because there's space for everyone. You died for it, and you rose again to say that death and sin will no longer have any power. Hey, thanks for watching the podcast. If you want to connect with us, click one of the links in the description there to get to our page, where there's all sorts of ways that you can find out more information about our church community, what we're doing, and how you can get involved with that. Hope you continue to stay. Make sure you like and subscribe. Share this with your friends if you think it's meaningful. And I hope you have a wonderful week. Grace and peace, friends.